The scream tore through the night like cloth ripped apart in careless hands. Villagers ran toward the riverbank, their bare feet slapping against the wet earth. And there, waist deep in the dark water, stood little Mary. Her eyes were rolled back so only the whites showed, her body trembling as though an unseen hand held her upright. Words poured from her lips in a language no one had taught her, words that made the river churn and heave as if it, too, understood. Lightning split the sky though not a single cloud had gathered, and the fish leapt in frantic arcs, slapping the surface with tails of silver. Grace, her mother, pushed through the crowd, her wrapper soaked with panic. She stretched her arms toward her daughter, but an invisible force dragged the child deeper, inch by inch, into the hungry waters. "Mary!" Grace screamed, her voice cracking like a calabash dropped on stone. The girl turned once, her mouth shaping a single desperate word, "Mama." Then the river swallowed her whole, leaving only ripples that glowed faintly in the moonlight. And as the villagers gasped and wailed, an elder whispered with shaking lips, "The river has come for its child." But stories do not begin where the screams are loudest. They begin in silence, in the quiet corners of a woman's heart, where longing grows heavier than the body can bear. To understand why the river rose to claim a child, we must return to the days when her mother's womb was an empty room, and her prayers were swallowed by shame. This is where it all began. Grace's womb was a quiet room that no child's laughter had ever disturbed. For 11 long years of marriage, it remained as silent as an abandoned shrine, and that silence clung to her like a second skin. In the courtyard of her husband's compound, women whispered as though their voices were small knives meant to pierce her from behind. When she bent to sweep the yard, she could hear them, soft yet cruel. "A yam without tendrils cannot climb, a woman without children cannot endure." Their words curled like smoke into her ears, filling her chest with ashes. Samuel, her husband, at first had been gentle, reminding her that patience was also a seed. But even his patience began to sour like palm wine left too long in the sun. He watched the sons of his brothers grow into tall boys and the daughters of his neighbors dance at moonlight festivals, and though he said little, his silence became a spear that stabbed at Grace's heart each night. At dawn, Grace often lingered by the doorway, her eyes fixed on the women with swollen bellies who carried water from the stream, their steps heavy with new life. Each time she turned away, her chest felt hollow, as if her ribs were the bars of a cage holding back a bird that had already died. She prayed in her mat, she fasted, she wore the marks of healers who promised fruitfulness, yet her belly remained flat, an empty field where the rains refused to fall. And still, she endured. But endurance is not the same as peace. At night, when Samuel's family mocked her behind closed doors, she pressed her ears to the mat and swallowed her tears like bitter cola. Her soul began to thirst for a miracle, a thirst so sharp that even shame could not quench it. And so, like a woman standing before a locked gate with no key, she began to think of other paths, dangerous ones, paths whispered in secret where the river spirits still bargained with desperate hearts. The night Grace chose to leave her compound, the moon was a thin blade in the sky, cutting the darkness but not enough to reveal her shame. She walked barefoot, each step sinking into the damp earth, her wrapper clinging to her legs as though urging her to turn back. The frogs croaked in uneven chorus, their voices rising like a warning, "Do not go, do not go." Yet her heart marched louder than their cries. In her hands, she carried a calabash filled with palm oil, salt, and a single white cloth, offerings her grandmother had once spoken of in hushed tones when women gathered to tell stories of spirits who granted children. Grace had laughed at those stories in her youth, but now desperation had carved the laughter out of her. As she reached the riverbank, the air thickened, heavy with the smell of wet earth and unseen things. The water shimmered under the pale moonlight, shifting and alive, as though it had been waiting for her. Her knees hit the sand with a force that made her bones ache. She lifted her trembling hands, pouring palm oil into the current, watching the red thread spread like blood into the dark waters. The salt followed, dissolving into what felt like forever. And then her voice broke out, low at first, then rising, as though her womb itself was speaking. "River spirit, hear me. I am mocked, I am empty, I am undone. Give me a child, and I will give the child back to you. She will be yours, as surely as the river flows to the sea." The words tasted like poison on her tongue, yet she did not swallow them back. A sudden breeze tore through the trees, rustling their branches until they clapped like restless hands. The water stirred, ripples rolling outward though no stone had been thrown. Grace's heart stopped. In that moment she felt the river listening, its silence heavy as a promise sealed. A single fish leapt from the water, its scales flashing silver before it vanished back into the depths. Grace shivered, her breath caught in her throat. She rose quickly, leaving the calabash half buried in the sand, and walked away without looking back. For she knew if she turned, she might see eyes staring at her from the water, eyes that would remind her that a bargain, once made, is never forgotten. For weeks after that night at the river, Grace walked as though carrying a secret shadow stitched to her back. By day, she continued her duties, pounding yam until her arms ached, washing Samuel's clothes by the stream, moving about the compound with the quiet obedience expected of a wife. But when dusk fell and Samuel returned, his eyes always searching her body for something it could not yet give, Grace swallowed her fear and offered him her body again and again. Their mat became both battlefield and prayer ground, a place where sweat mingled with hope. She felt his urgency in the way he pressed into her, as though sheer will could break open the closed doors of her womb. And each time, she prayed silently, "Let this be the time. Let my shame end here." Nights bled into one another, the rhythm of their attempts unchanging, but Grace did not stop. For she knew now that she was not only trying for Samuel, nor for herself, but to complete a bargain whispered into the belly of a river. The rains came that year in thick, pounding sheets, filling the farmlands with green and swelling the river until it licked the roots of the palm trees. With the rains came the annual Yam festival, when the village gathered to dance, feast, and honor the harvest. Grace dressed in her oldest wrapper, worn but clean, tying it firmly at her waist. She moved among the women, carrying food to the square, laughing when expected, though her laughter felt like a pot with no fire beneath it. But as the drumming rose and the air thickened with song and roasted yam, Grace felt her body betray her. A sudden dizziness struck her like a hidden hand. The ground tilted, her head spun, and before she could stop herself, she stumbled, spilling the calabash of palm wine she carried. Women rushed to her side, their eyes sharp, their tongues quick. "Perhaps it is the sun. Perhaps it is weakness." Grace pressed a hand to her stomach, and in that instant, a warmth spread through her, a fullness she had never known. It was as if the river had curled itself into her belly, silent but present. Days later, when her monthly blood failed to arrive, she knew. Grace lay awake that night beside Samuel, listening to the rise and fall of his breath, her hands resting on the still flat plane of her stomach. A small, secret smile tugged at her lips. She wanted to cry out, to shout it to the stars, to call the mocking voices of the village women and silence them forever. But instead, she held it inside her like a precious bead, rolling it in her heart with awe and fear. When she finally told Samuel weeks later, his laughter burst forth like a gourd of palm wine cracked open too soon. He lifted her, twirled her in the small compound, tears bright in his eyes. His family, once sharp-tongued and cruel, now softened, their words sweetened as though honey had suddenly filled their mouths. Grace walked through the village with her head higher, her back straighter, her steps lightened. And yet, deep within her joy, there remained a whisper, quiet as the rustle of river reeds, a promise is never forgotten. She silenced it, convincing herself that spirits forget, that gods, too, lose interest when the world grows noisy. But in the secret hours of night, when the house was quiet and the river's distant hum floated through the trees, Grace would clutch her belly and pray that the life within her belonged wholly to her, and not to the waters that once listened. Grace's belly swelled like a ripening calabash, and with each moon that passed, her joy was braided tightly with fear. At night she lay on her mat, one hand resting over her stomach, whispering prayers that slipped between faith and desperation. "Lord above, let this child be yours, not the river's," she murmured, her words trembling like the flame of a weak lamp. When the baby kicked, she smiled, yet sometimes the movement felt like ripples rolling through her body, as though the child swam rather than stirred. The thought made her chest tighten, and she would press her lips shut to stop herself from crying out. Samuel, proud once more, began to walk differently through the village. He straightened his shoulders, his eyes glowing with the satisfaction of a man whose name would not die unremembered. At gatherings, he spoke loudly of yam harvests, goats, and the strength of his family, his words aimed at his brothers who once mocked him. Grace watched him from the corner of her eyes, her heart split between pride and sorrow, knowing he did not understand that this child had been bought with a vow she could never confess. The village itself shifted toward her. The same women who once turned their backs now came with gifts of herbs and groundnut soup, stroking her arms, calling her Aya Abai, mother-to-be. But Grace felt the hollowness of their kindness, for she remembered their old laughter, sharp as broken clay pots, and forgiveness did not wash away scars. Still, she smiled and accepted, for a pregnant woman cannot afford enemies. Some nights, she woke to dreams so vivid she felt drenched in them, a river swelling, voices echoing beneath its surface, and a child's laughter bouncing across the waters. Each time, she woke with sweat clinging to her neck, the baby restless beneath her ribs, as though stirred by the same unseen voices. During her final month, she grew too heavy to fetch water or pound yam, and she sat often beneath the udala tree in the courtyard, her hands resting like anchors on her stomach. The village children gathered near her, their eyes wide as they listened to her hum old songs. "This child will be beautiful," one girl whispered. Grace nodded, though in her heart she feared beauty might be a dangerous thing. The night her labor began, the sky was cloudless, yet thunder rumbled far away like a warning traveling from one world to another. Grace clutched the edge of her mat, her body racked with waves of pain that rose and fell like tides. Samuel hovered, pacing like a restless goat, while women crowded into the hut, their voices rising in chants, urging her to push, to breathe, to endure. Sweat poured down her body, mingling with her tears, and for a moment, she thought she heard the river again, whispering, "Remember your promise." Her heart clenched, and she cried out louder, forcing the child into the world. Then, as the final cry escaped her lips, the baby slid into waiting hands, a girl, her skin smooth as palm wine, her eyes bright even in the dim glow of the lantern. When they placed her on Grace's chest, the newborn's tiny fingers curled around her mother's skin with startling strength, as though refusing to let go. The women clapped their hands, ululated, and praised God for his mercy, their voices loud enough to drown the whispers only Grace could hear. She stared at her daughter's face, radiant and perfect, and in that fragile moment of love, she almost believed the river had forgotten. Almost. Mary grew quickly, and from the beginning, she carried a strangeness that could not be hidden beneath swaddling cloth. She laughed easily, her giggle like a bell ringing across the courtyard, but sometimes the sound seemed to ripple, as if carried on water though no stream was near. By the time she could walk, fish would gather at the shallow edge of the river whenever she approached, circling in restless patterns, their silver scales catching the sun. At first, villagers marveled, calling her child of blessing. But whispers began when she turned 7. At a festival where drums thundered and dancers twirled, Mary suddenly fell to the ground, her body stiff, her lips moving with words no one taught her. The air thickened, and a wind rose from nowhere, scattering dust into the crowd. The old women crossed themselves and hissed, "Omo Omi, child of the water." Grace rushed to her side, pressing the girl against her chest, but she saw the fear in the villagers' eyes, saw how quickly awe could turn to suspicion. That night, when Samuel pressed her for an explanation, Grace gave only silence. She clutched Mary tightly, her heart pounding with the knowledge that her vow was no longer sleeping but awake, stretching its hands toward what belonged to it. But secrets have a way of rising, like oil refusing to sink in water. Months later, Samuel discovered the truth not from Grace, but from Elder Thomas, who had seen the offerings she left at the river before Mary's birth. Samuel's rage was a storm that broke their compound walls. He shouted until his voice cracked, his words striking like whips, you gave my child away. You sold her before she was born." Grace fell to her knees, tears streaming down her face, begging him to understand. "I wanted only to give us a child. I wanted only to end the shame." But Samuel turned his back, his shoulders rigid with betrayal, and the love that once tied them began to fray. Soon after, the rains failed, the river shrank into a narrow wound in the earth, and the land cracked with hunger. The villagers gathered in fear, bringing sacrifices to the water, but Elder Thomas shook his head and said, "The God wants its child. Until she is returned, no rain will fall." That night, thunder growled across a cloudless sky, and Mary stood at the threshold, her small frame trembling, her eyes wide and empty. The wind whipped through the compound, overturning pots and scattering ashes, while the river swelled in the distance though no rain had yet fallen. Grace clung to her daughter, her arms a cage of desperate love, but she knew cages cannot hold what spirits claim. Outside, lightning cracked, turning night into blinding white, and in the sudden hush that followed, the river seemed to whisper from afar, "Bring her to me." Mary was no longer a child of careless laughter, she had begun to carry her strangeness like a second skin. At night she would wake trembling, her eyes glazed with visions she could not explain. Sometimes she told Grace of dreams where she walked on water as if it were solid ground, where voices hummed beneath her feet, promising her secrets she could never repeat. Other times, she sat silently by the riverbank, her toes curled into the mud, her face tilted toward the water as though listening for a lullaby no one else could hear. Grace, terrified, pulled her daughter away, clutching her as if her embrace alone could sever the invisible cord binding Mary to the river. "You are mine, not theirs," she whispered into the girl's hair, her words shaking like leaves in a storm. Yet she could feel the truth pulsing through Mary's small body, the river was inside her, whispering louder each day. The village began to notice. Women muttered as they fetched water, their buckets swaying nervously when Mary passed. Men shook their heads, calling her a sign of anger from the gods. Elder Thomas warned Samuel that a promise made in desperation could not be ignored, that Mary's presence was the reason the river refused to bless their crops. And though Samuel shouted that he would never surrender his blood, his eyes betrayed doubt, the kind that grows when hunger sits too long at a man's table. Mary herself began to fear what she did not understand. "Mama, why do they look at me as if I am not like them?" she asked one evening, her small hands clutching Grace's wrapper. Grace pulled her close, but her heart twisted with an ache words could not soften. How could she tell her daughter that she had been promised before she drew her first breath, that her very life was borrowed from a river that now demanded its price? Samuel, worn and bitter, accused Grace of cursing them all. Their home became a place of silence broken only by quarrels, his anger like lightning, her guilt like thunder. Yet Grace fought with the stubborn love of a mother who would rather break than surrender. She took Mary to healers in faraway villages, offering goat and kola nut, begging for charms to break the covenant. But every charm withered in her hands, powerless against the vow sealed in the belly of the river. And still, the whispers grew. At night, when the village slept, Mary would rise, her feet carrying her to the threshold as though pulled by invisible hands. Grace barred the door with stones, slept with her daughter's hand locked in hers, but she knew the day would come when the river's call would be stronger than her grip. Then, one fateful evening, as the sky flared with the red of an angry sunset, Mary's voice trembled with a confession, "Mama, sometimes the river speaks my name." Grace's heart froze. For in that moment, she knew the battle was no longer only hers, it was already inside the child, as natural as blood, as inevitable as rain. Inside the child, as natural as blood, as inevitable as rain. The storm came without warning. The sky, clear only moments before, folded into itself, bruised with darkness. Thunder groaned like an old giant waking, and lightning clawed across the heavens. In the village square, people ran with mats and baskets over their heads, their shouts mixing with the roar of wind. But Grace could not hear them. Her ears were filled only with Mary's voice, calling faintly from the riverbank where she stood, her small frame lit in flashes of white fire. Grace's heart stumbled inside her chest. She dropped the pestle in her hands and ran, her wrapper flapping like a torn sail behind her. "Mary," she screamed, her voice already shredded by the wind. When she reached the bank, she saw her daughter waist-deep in the raging water, her eyes rolled back, her lips whispering words no child should know. The river surged higher with every syllable, its waves foaming and clawing at the land as if eager to swallow it. Villagers gathered at a distance, their faces masks of fear, and Elder Thomas raised his hands, shouting above the storm, "The river has come for its child." Samuel stood rigid, torn between terror and pride, his fists clenched, his eyes unable to look at Grace. She waded in, the water biting cold against her skin, her arms reaching, her love stronger than fear. "Take me instead," she cried into the howling dark, her voice breaking like wood on stone. For a breathless moment, the storm stilled, and it seemed the river listened. Then a voice deeper than thunder rolled from the depths, "A vow cannot be traded. What was promised must return." Mary's body arched, her arms spread wide, and before Grace could pull her close, invisible hands dragged the girl beneath the black waters. When the storm passed, silence lay heavy on the land. The river, calm as glass, flowed as though it had never risen in anger. Grace lay collapsed on the bank, her body shivering, her hair now streaked with sudden white. Samuel stood behind her, broken, his shoulders bowed as though carrying the weight of a curse too heavy for any man. The villagers drifted away, whispering, their faces pale with awe and relief, for already they could smell the coming rain in the air. But Grace remained, her fingers clawing at the wet earth, her eyes fixed on the water. Days turned into weeks, and still she sat by the river, her wrapper stained, her face hollow, whispering, "Forgive me, my child," into the rippling surface. Children said they sometimes heard laughter in the river, soft and sweet, as if Mary still played beneath the waves. Some swore they saw her face in the current, bright as moonlight, watching them before vanishing into the depths. And then, many years later, during another drought, when the river swelled again with sudden force, a figure emerged. It was a girl, no older than 12, her eyes glowing faintly, her hair dripping silvered water. She stood at the edge, her voice barely above a whisper, yet it cut through the village like a blade, "Mama, I have come home." Grace, older now, rose on trembling legs, her heart caught between terror and wonder. For she knew that some promises never die, and some children belong to two worlds. Dear viewers, a vow is like a shadow, it follows you until the sun sets. Grace's promise to the river gave her joy, but it also took what her heart cherished most. This story reminds us that every word spoken in desperation carries a price. Be careful what you promise, and to whom. Yet the river is not finished, Mary's story is not over. Part 2 will reveal if love can break a covenant older than stone. If this tale touched you, share it, reflect on it, and walk carefully with your own words. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel.